Step back in time to the fall of 1777. 2 miles in front of you is the Hudson River. To your left, 8 miles up the river is Saratoga, and the working estate of General Philip Schuyler. It's Schuylerville today. From this direction, advancing from the north, is General John Burgoyne, in command of 7,000 British, German, Canadian, and Tory soldiers, and their camp followers. The artillery train consisted of 41 guns and mortars of various calibers. His advance from the north, down the Richelieu River, Lake Champlain, to Skeensboro through Fort Anne and down the Hudson River, was part of Burgoyne's grand strategy. The plan called for the advance of 2 armies from Montreal and New York to effect a juncture at Albany. Such a move would establish a chain of strong points from the St. Lawrence to the Atlantic, isolating New England, the stronghold of the rebellion from the rest of the colonies. As the main army advanced towards Crown Point and Ticonderoga, Colonel Barry St. Leger would lead an additional force of 1,000 Loyalists, regulars, and Indians down the St. Lawrence and through the Great Lakes to provide a diversion on the Mohawk River. To your right is Bemis Heights, occupied by the Continental Army, 7,000 strong under Major General Horatio Gates. General Gates took over command of the Northern Department of the American Army on August 19th. By early September, he had matured a strategy for defeating General Burgoyne. The army had moved northward to the heights behind Jotham Bemis's Tavern, where a bend in the river forced the road to Albany against the base of the hills. Here, under the direction of the 31-year-old Polish engineer, Colonel Tadeusz Kosciuszko, the Americans built entrenchments that blocked the road and fortified the bluffs. The main line of entrenchments stretched from a ravine behind the bluff to the John Nilsson farm on the crest of the heights, then southwest for 3/4 of a mile. 22 cannon were placed at strategic points. Pickets manned outposts north of the camp. Reinforcements arrived daily. The army would more than double in size over the next few weeks. The Americans were ready. The next step was up to Burgoyne. As you leave the parking lot, make note of the ground cover and terrain along the sides of the tour road. The parklands today are managed according to a historic base map and closely resemble their appearance of October 8, 1777, the day after the Second Battle. From stop number 3, one can begin to understand the attraction these heights held for General Gates. These bluffs provide a fairly sheer drop of over 100 feet to the narrow floodplain and the riverbed below. Earthworks on the plain below would block any movement south along the river or the road. These works were manned by the Massachusetts troops of General John Glover's brigade. Glover's men were the most recent reinforcements to the Northern Army and were some of the steadiest veterans. Fortifications and artillery placed on the heights where you are now protected the works below and were in turn protected by works on another height just to the south. British scouts could see this formidable interlocking system and persuaded General Burgoyne that testing them would be folly. This is where Kosciuszko's skill as a military engineer was first appreciated. This part of the American lines on top of the bluff was occupied by the Massachusetts men of General John Nixon's brigade and detachments of Major Ebenezer Stevens' artillery. At stop number 4, you will be facing north. Between the two battles of Saratoga on September 19th and October 7th, advance pickets from both armies faced each other across the middle ravine. The farmhouse that stood here served as an American observation post. As General Gates' army received reinforcements and continued to fortify its position, General Burgoyne anxiously waited for help that would not come. General Howe, who was expected to come north from New York to join Burgoyne, would direct his attention toward Philadelphia. Colonel Barry St. Ledger, who was to have come from the west through the Mohawk Valley, was turned back at Fort Stanwix by the combined efforts of Colonel Peter Gainsford, General Nicholas Herkimer, and the one the Indians called Heap Fighting Chief, Benedict Arnold. Gates' army continued to grow. Burgoyne was on his own. Then on the afternoon of October 7th, excited American pickets reported large formations of Crown forces advancing southward. In front of this small rise is a small field bisected by a road running east and west. The northern half of the field was ringed with a worm fence and contained a small farmhouse, which the Germans referred to as the Wieserhaus. The southern part of the field was planted with corn, referred to by some Europeans as Turkish wheat. Further west was a small strip of brushy woods. Then another field can be seen. On October 7th, General Burgoyne ordered a reconnaissance in force to probe the American position from the high ground west to the Nielsen farm. If conditions proved favorable, he would launch an all-out attack on the 8th. If not, he would retreat and try to save his army. It was a gamble, but Burgoyne was proud, brave, and an old gamester. The probing force was carefully chosen for mobility and shock power. From General Simon Fraser's advanced corps came the British Grenadiers and Light Infantry, Burgoyne's elite units, and the 24th Regiment. Also from the advanced corps came the German Jaegers, Chasseurs, and Grenadiers, men who would have been the pride of any European army. Men from the Hanau, Retz, von Riedesel, and Specht regiments were drafted from the German General Baron Frederick Adolf von Riedesel's division. Brigadier General Hamilton's division contributed men from the 9th, 20th, 21st, and 62nd British regiments. 10 cannons served by 107 artillerymen accompanied the column. Over 1,700 officers and men, including General Burgoyne himself, marched out of the camp, leaving the remaining forces to man the fortifications and await the outcome of the probing action. When the advance guard reached a point west of the Barber farm, the column halted. While officers tried to scan the American works through the telescopes from the cabin's roof and soldiers foraged for grain in the abandoned fields, the British forces dressed into lines behind the worm fence. The British front, which extended from the woods west of the Barber farm to the southern fringe of the Freeman farm, was mostly open, but the flanks rested in the woods. James Wilkinson, the American Deputy Adjutant General, reported the British position to General Gates, saying, "They are foraging and endeavoring to reconnoiter your left, and I think, sir, they offer you battle." Gates asked, "What is the nature of the ground and what's your opinion?" Wilkinson replied, "Their front is open and their flanks rest on woods under cover of which they might be attacked. Their right is skirted by a lofty height. I would indulge them." "Well then, order on Morgan to begin the game," Gates answered. The American attack opened between 2:30 and 3:30 p.m. Colonel Morgan's Corps of Riflemen and Light Infantry under Major Henry Dearborn struck the British right, composed of General Fraser's Light Infantry and the 24th Regiment. General Enoch Poor's brigade of New Hampshiremen and New Yorkers moved up through the brushy woods behind you and attacked the British Grenadiers and the units of General Hamilton's division. General Ebenezer Learned's target was the Germans in the center of the column. Learned's brigade was soon supported by Brigadier General Tenbrook's brigade of Albany Militia and a regiment from Jonathan Warner's brigade of Massachusetts Militia. General Poor's men soon overwhelmed the greatly outnumbered British Grenadiers, whose commander, Major John Dyke Ackland, fell badly wounded. Burgoyne's aide, Lieutenant Sir Francis Clerk, was mortally wounded while trying to pass his general's orders to retreat. Captain George Pausch of the German artillery, while directing the service of his two 6-pound cannons, in a desperate attempt to hold back the American onslaught with canister shot as if they were two large shotguns, suddenly noticed that his supporting infantry had been driven off. After a gallant scuffle to save his guns, he and his artillerymen were forced to abandon them. General Fraser's veterans began to fall before the deadly accuracy of Morgan's Pennsylvania and Virginia riflemen, who fired from the woods west of the Barber Farm. As the British right was rolled back, General Fraser rode among his men, encouraging and rallying them to maintain their ranks, keep up their fire, and make the Americans pay dearly for every foot of ground. But the Scotsman's efforts were in vain. He could not stop the turning movement. The gallant General Fraser came under the heavy fire of the American riflemen and fell mortally wounded. While Colonel Morgan and General Poor drove back the enemy's flanks, General Learned's brigade struck the Germans, who, with both flanks exposed, stubbornly fought them off. In the midst of the attack, Benedict Arnold rode onto the field, and though he had no command and was confined to camp due to an altercation with his commander, General Gates, led a second assault that caused the Germans to join the general retreat to the Valkyrie's redoubt. By 5 p.m., the British probing column had lost 8 cannon and had suffered more than 400 casualties. Burgoyne's advance was thwarted, but behind the strong walls of the Valkyrie's redoubt, his soldiers could put up a stiff fight, as Poor's men would discover. John Freeman and his family established this small farm about 11 years before the battle. Of loyalist sympathies, Freeman had to abandon the farm and move his family to Canada. He returned with Burgoyne as a member of a loyalist regiment known as Jessup's Corps. His small cabin stood just beyond the 2 artillery pieces you see on the left. We are a little more than a mile north of the American lines and about the same distance from the Hudson to the east. On September 19th, General Burgoyne advanced, deploying a 3-column movement toward the American position, whose extent and strength were unknown to him. General Fraser commanded the right column, composed of the German and British light infantry, grenadiers, loyalists, Canadians, and 12 guns. The center column, led by General Hamilton, consisted of 1,600 men with 4 cannon, including the battalion companies of the 9th, 20th, 21st, and 62nd Regiments of the British line. Burgoyne accompanied this element. The left column was commanded by General von Riedesel and included the German regiments of von Riedesel, Sept, von Retz, Hesse-Hanau, dragoons, light infantrymen known as Chaucers and Jaegers, 6 battalion companies of the British 47th Regiment, and 8 cannon. The Germans had been sent to America by contracts between their Duke and King George III of England, who was also the Elector of Hanover, one of many German city-states. General Fraser's column marched along the road running westward from the river road to a point 3 miles from the river, and then turned southward. Hamilton's column followed Fraser's a short distance, turned south at the first road and marched to the Great Ravine, crossed it, and moved west to a point north of the Freeman's farm. General von Riedesel's column marched out along the river road. When the columns reached their assigned positions, a signal gun would coordinate a simultaneous movement against the Americans. Learning of the enemy's movements, General Gates ordered Colonel Daniel Morgan's Rifle Corps and Major Henry Dearborn's Light Infantry Battalion to reconnoiter the woods and fields of the American lines. They were followed by the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd New Hampshire regiments from General Enoch Poor's brigade. At about noon, a part of Morgan's Corps fired upon and killed or wounded most of the advance guard of General Hamilton's column in the Freeman Farm clearing. The riflemen rushed forward to pursue the survivors and ran head-on into the main body of Hamilton's division. The British drove Colonel Morgan's men south of the farm, where they scattered. Morgan was chagrined by the sudden disorganization of his command, but with the persistent use of his turkey call, he rallied the men and deployed on the fringe of the farm clearing. After a brief lull, during which the New Hampshire regiments joined the riflemen, the fight resumed. As it intensified, other regiments of General Porras' brigade, followed by Brigadier General Ebenezer Learned's brigade and the 10th Massachusetts Regiment from Brigadier General John Patterson's brigade, were committed. Morgan's riflemen and General Porras' troops bore the brunt of the fight, while the other units faced General Fraser, preventing him from going to General Hamilton's support. For more than 3 hours, the battle rolled back and forth across the weed-grown, stump-studded farm. The American troops, most of whom were veteran regulars, deployed, attacked, retreated, and rallied in a disciplined and soldierly manner. The British regiments upheld the great traditions of their service, counterattacking again and again with the bayonet, against increasingly heavy odds. But all their gallantry and skill were inadequate to counter the Americans' numerical advantage and superior firepower. At around 6 p.m., in response to an urgent order from General Burgoyne, General von Redouzel's Germans appeared from the east, colors flying, singing hymns. Fresh troops from the regiments von Redouzel, von Retz, and Pausch's Hesse-Hanau artillery engaged the American right in support of the slowly retreating British. The newly reinforced ground forces rallied, delivering yet another bayonet charge, and at dusk, the Americans withdrew to their fortification on Bemis Heights. Both sides claimed victory. Burgoyne remained on the field of battle. Gates still blocked the road to Albany. The British would spend the next 17 days erecting fortifications facing those of the Americans. Their western flank would be protected by 2 redoubts. One would be a very formidable work, its outline appearing as white posts with red tops. It would become known as the Balcarres Redoubt, after Major Alexander Lindsay, the Earl of Balcarres, who commanded the light infantry defending this work. Built of horizontal logs, it was nearly 500 yards long and mounted 8 cannon. It was to this position that most of the survivors of the fighting in the wheat field on October 7th fled. The British Army dug in after the fighting of the first battle on September 19th. Their western flank would be protected by two outworks known as redoubts. The larger of the two, the Balcarres Redoubt, was erected on the Freeman farm, a little more than 500 yards south of here at Stop 6. That strong work was described earlier. The second, known as the Bremen Redoubt, after Lieutenant Colonel Heinrich C. Bremen, commander of the Brunswick Grenadiers, ran roughly north and south along the crest of the rise to your left. It was of lighter construction, apparently rail-like logs piled between uprights with no earth packed against the outside. Mounting two 6-pounder cannon, it was about 300 yards long. On the morning of October 7th, many of the Loyalists and Brunswickers manning this redoubt accompanied General Fraser's corps, which was to again probe the American left. This would leave a mixed group of only 200 Brunswick Grenadiers, Jaegers, and Loyalists to defend it. After General Fraser's corps was stopped that afternoon in the wheat field, most of the survivors retreated to the stronger Balcarres Redoubt, which was closer. The Bremen was then seriously undermanned. While the British and Germans retreated into their works, fresh American troops arrived from the American camp at Bemis Heights. Brigadier General John Patterson's brigade, one of John Glover's regiments, and the 5th and 6th Massachusetts from John Nixon's brigade brought the number of Americans on the battlefield to more than 8,000. While General Poor's men fought and died in front of the stronger Balcarres Redoubt, General Learned's and Colonel Morgan's men, reinforced by the fresh Massachusetts regiments, deployed to attack Burgoyne's right flank, consisting of the Germans in the Bremen Redoubt and 2 companies of Canadian militia in the log cabins between the redoubt and the Freeman farm. The Canadians were soon driven from their posts, exposing the left and rear of Colonel Bremen's position. The Americans then mounted a massive attack on the Germans. While most of the men stormed the front of the redoubt, a part of General Learned's command and some riflemen swept through the gap left by the Canadians and into the Germans' rear. During the final minutes of the attack, as remnants of Colonel Bremen's corps made their last desperate stand, General Arnold, who had been leading Poor's troops in a series of futile and costly attempts to carry the Balcarres Redoubt, heard the firing on his left and joined a party of riflemen firing into the Germans from the rear. Just as the defense collapsed, he suffered a leg wound, now memorialized by the famous Boot Monument on the battlefield. Colonel Bremen, desperately trying to prevent his men from fleeing at sword point, was shot, many believed by his own men. Darkness ended the day's fighting. Possession of the Bremen Redoubt opened the right and rear of Burgoyne's camp to the Americans. That night, leaving their campfires burning, the Royal Army withdrew under cover of darkness to the great redoubt overlooking the river road where lay their hospital, artillery park, and supply depot. Along the path, on the southern end of the redoubt, is the granite Boot Monument. The inscription on one side details the actions of General Benedict Arnold at the Bremen Redoubt. The other side is a relief carving of a left boot, draped over a cannon barrel muzzle down, a sign of defeat or disgrace. The boot is topped with a Major General's 2-star epaulet and a crown with laurel wreath. General Arnold's name does not appear on the monument. wayside exhibit marked by the large flags in the field indicates the approximate location of General Burgoyne's headquarters. It was located near a spring, no longer visible from the surface, but from which water in today's visitor center is drawn. Between September 19th and October 7th, 1777, General Burgoyne occupied several large tents known as marquees, using them as his office and headquarters, as well as his bedroom and dining room. Such an assemblage was common for general officers' field headquarters in the 18th century. Spread out through the fields and woods on either side of you would have been the camps of the British 9th, 21st, 62nd, and 20th regiments, with the Brunswick regiments von Riedesel and Sept for a total of some 4,000 men. The soldiers would occupy small canvas wedge tents, roughly the size of a modern pup tent, expected to shelter 2 people. In the armies of the 18th century, such a tent would be shared by 5 to 6 men. These tent mates would also share a small iron cooking kettle, cooking much of their own rations collectively. They would share the carrying of the tent poles, canvas, and kettle while on a march. Each group was known as a mess. The gray poles with yellow panels mark the boundaries of the 20th Regiment's camp in the field in front of you. Along the southern edge of the field, you can see the white posts with red tops. These indicate the main British line as it stood overlooking the ravines during the period between battles. The redoubts occupying this hilltop and the two to your left were known collectively as the Great Redoubt. They protected the British hospital, artillery park, and baggage train, all on the narrow floodplain below. A bridge of boats temporarily spanned the Hudson just below this hill. Looking left to the north is one of the most dramatic vistas in the park. Across the Hudson, clearly visible, are Willard Mountain in Washington County, with the Green Mountains of Vermont beyond. As you look north along the Hudson and between the mountains, imagine yourself a cold, wet, and discouraged British soldier on reduced rations. After the two hard-fought battles of Saratoga, safety in Ticonderoga are some 60 miles ahead of you by foot.
Many visitors pause here to enjoy the view, take photographs, or visit wayside exhibits. Please feel free to do so.
There are wayside exhibits just down the path to the southeast that indicate the second of three fortifications that made up what was known as the Great Redoubt. After the Battle of October 7th, Burgoyne's army drew itself up into these works and the area immediately below, preparing to retreat northward. It was to a small house below, occupied by Madame von Redazel, wife of the general, that Brigadier General Simon Fraser was taken after being mortally wounded in the Barber wheat field that afternoon. Realizing death was near, he requested to be buried in the Great Redoubt the next day. Burgoyne complied with his trusted subordinate's wishes, and in the company of his senior officers, attended the burial ceremony at sunset on October 8th, amidst a cannonading by the American guns. The British Army would begin its retreat to Saratoga, today's Schuylerville, 8 miles to the north, that night, under the cover of a rainstorm. The rainstorm continued through the 9th of October. As Burgoyne's badly mauled army continued their retreat north through a sea of mud, General Gates' soldiers drew and cooked rations and replenished their ammunition. On the 10th, the rain abated, and General Gates issued orders to start after the enemy. By 4 p.m., they had arrived at Saratoga to find the British encamped on the heights beyond Fish Creek, entrenched and ready to defend themselves. The American army then deployed to surround the British. A ring of 5 brigades under Generals Poor, Patterson, Learned, Nixon, and Glover pinned Burgoyne's army against the Hudson from the west. Colonel Morgan's riflemen blocked the way north. General John Fellow's 3,000 militia occupied the east side of the river, preventing escape to that side. The remnants of the British Army were under constant cannon and musket fire for the next 3 days. On October 13th, General Burgoyne, on the advice of his subordinates, sent a message to General Gates proposing a, quote, cessation of arms during the time necessary to communicate the preliminary terms by which in any extremity he and the Army mean to abide. The terms were agreed upon, and at 10 o'clock on October 17th, the British Army marched out of its camp carrying their arms in strict formation as the musicians played the Grenadiers' March. On the parade near the ruins of Old Fort Hardy, the gallant soldiers of the Crown parked their cannon, deposited their muskets, and emptied their cartridge boxes in the presence of only 2 American officers. The Convention Army then crossed Fish Creek and marched between the lines of the victorious Americans, who showed not the slightest sign of disrespect. At noon, General Burgoyne and his officers were escorted to General Gates' marquee. Burgoyne removed his hat, bowed, and pronounced, "General, the fortune of war has made me your prisoner." Gates replied, "You will always find me ready to testify that it was not brought about by any fault of your excellency." Then, in view of both armies, General Burgoyne stepped back, drew his sword, and presented it to General Gates, who received and returned it. As the British Army marched away into captivity, the principal officers of both armies retired to the marquee to dine. Thus would end one of the most dramatic episodes of the American Revolution. With the surrender of Burgoyne's army at Saratoga, now Schuylerville, on October 17, 1777, the first British to ever surrender in the field, the world would sit up and take notice. Early the following year, the French court, convinced of the sincerity of the American quest for independence and encouraged at their prospects of achieving it, would openly declare war on Great Britain. The subsequent flow of French arms, equipage, an army, and a navy would make possible the ultimate American victory almost 4 years later at Yorktown on October 19, 1781. Saratoga would take its place in history as the turning point of the American Revolution.
Hello, everybody. My name is Ed McClements, and I'm the current president of the Stillwater Historical Society. And as we're coming to October 7th, we are going to be at the battlefield on that day because it marks the anniversary of the second battle at Saratoga, which really, by historians, are said to be one of the 10 most important battles in the history of mankind. It certainly did determine, as being the turning point of the American Revolution, in which France decided to join the side of the American rebels and help us fight for our independence. So we now enjoy that freedom that was earned by the brave soldiers who fought for the independence of America. I have had the pleasure of doing several other videos of the park rangers doing a discussion of each of the battles at Saratoga, and also a video that commemorated the surrender of Burgoyne in Old Saratoga, now Schuylerville. And these are all available on YouTube, and I'd encourage you to take a look and enjoy the great job that the Rangers have done in providing such a great narration of what occurred at the very spots that are so close to us here. So we hope you've enjoyed the tour, and we look forward to having you stop at the YouTube channel that we have and give us some feedback as to how we can provide additional information of this type for you and your family. God bless, and don't forget to vote, because that freedom was very expensive at the men who fought and died at the Saratoga battlefields. Thank you.